Welcome, everyone, to the Blue Sustainability and Society Initiative's issue on sea turtles. Today, I'm very pleased to be talking to Kartik Shanker, who is Professor at the Centre for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. We'll be talking about some of his work on sea turtles and perhaps some broader themes and ideas in his excellent work on ecology more generally. So I wondered if it would be useful for the audience if you could give a brief overview of your work on sea turtles.
Right. Um, thanks, Noah, for having me on here. Um, I started working on sea turtles actually as an undergraduate. I was doing a bachelor's in zoology and discovered that in the city where I lived, used to be called Madras, it's now called Chennai, and this was in the late 80s. Um, a herpetologist, a conservationist named Rom Whitaker, originally from the US and then settled in India. He'd started a bunch of reptile programs, crocodiles, snakes, and so on. And he was, started something called the Madras Snake Park and the Crocodile Bank. He and his colleagues had started what they called turtle walks, which was essentially patrolling the beaches of Madras to prevent turtle eggs from being taken. And they had started their first hatchery actually in the backyard of a friend's house in 1973, and that sort of had grown into into this iconic. Even by the 80s, turtle walks were well known. There were uh, non-profits and government that would maintain hatcheries, and the government maintained hatcheries. The non-profits took people out on these night patrols. So I heard about it, and the year that I got in, the year I got involved, it turned out that the forest department was stopping. It was no longer going to maintain hatcheries, and so we formed a students group. I was about 20. The oldest person in our group was a few years older than I was, and we started this organization. Uh, Set up our first hatchery, restarted these turtle walks, and that organization today is um, 38 years old. The students group still sort of conducts those turtle walks, and with the forest department maintains a hatchery. So that was, I sort of really started as it was sort of it felt like a hobby in the sense that it was something external to what I was doing academically.
Mm,
Um, and so then later on, I did a PhD that was not on sea turtles, but my postdoctoral work, and subsequently, I kind of got back into sea turtle research. And for since about 2007 or so, when I sort of got into the current position that I am, um, parallelly around that time, we started another sort of coastal and marine conservation NGO called Dakshin Foundation. And so through my work at IISc and with Dakshin Foundation, we've started these monitoring programs for green turtles, leatherbacks, and olive ridleys
mm.
at different important sites across India. So that's kind of the starting from that little bit of voluntary work over 30 years ago. Now that sort of getting back into it professionally has involved, we work at multiple sites around the country, and like I said, we've been monitoring them for about nearly 20 years now. So,
Mm.
yeah.
Excellent. I mean, what drew you first to sea turtles? Why not, I don't know, another animal? What?
So, I think people get into ecology from, for different reasons. Some kids are just sort of interested in bugs and beetles. And
Mm,
uh, Rom Whitaker, whom I'd mentioned, uh, had grown up in, New York State, and from a very young age had sort of been really obsessed with snakes. So he was always going out, and like, catching snakes and other sorts of reptiles. He was a passionate bio biofield from a very young age. Other people sort of come to it later, and I think that for many of us, uh, at some stage, I mean, we always were fascinated with wildlife. Uh, you know, uh, I guess My mom kind of likes to take the credit. She says she took me to see Born Free when I was 5, and she says that's why you got interested in wildlife.
Yeah.
But like many other students in India, we thought it was a fun thing to do to go out and visit. Uh, you know, when we were younger, to go to a zoo, or in later years a national park. But I don't think we had necessarily thought of it as a profession.
Mm,
Uh, and in the 80s, there were two sort of really important pathways. Many people went out to a WWF nature camp, and
mm,
that sort of got them hooked to, wildlife biology or ecology as a potential discipline. And there were a few institutions then and now many more, of course. Then there were couple of places in India where you could do a master's in wildlife biology and conservation. So that became one path. And for many others, I mean, actually, for very many others, at least from Madras, it was going out on this turtle walk and suddenly discovering that it was something that you could actually pursue professionally. And so for me, I think it was going on a turtle walk because college wasn't enough, but
mm,
then discovering, as I've said many times before, you see your first nesting turtle or your first hatchling, and you kind of get really, really
mm.
hooked instantly. And you're like, wait a minute, this is what I want to be doing for the rest of my life,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, on a sort of scientific level, why are sea turtles important? Why should people be concerned about
I honestly don't believe that sea turtles are more important than any other organism.
them?
And I think I've spent the last few years campaigning that we should be less concerned about sea
Mm,
turtles than we are,
yeah.
and more concerned about the ecosystems,
Mm,
that they live in, and sort of the somewhat blinkered focus that sea turtles and pandas and whales and
mm,
tigers sometimes get is actually detrimental to conservation as a whole.
mm,
But I think, if I had to point out what was most important about sea turtles, I'd say they're the most accessible icons of conservation, amongst the most accessible icons of conservation in the world. Firstly, you find sea turtles in uh, most tropical and subtropical countries. Of all of those nations in the UN, there's only the landlocked ones and only the ones that have only sort of like subarctic coastlines that don't ever have turtles, right? I mean, you get turtles almost off every other shore, and if you're in tropical, subtropical regions, you get nesting turtles. So they're actually perhaps as a taxonomic group, like one of the most widespread icons of conservation. Secondly, you can get up close and personal with them.
mm,
You can go and sit next to a nesting turtle. When you have um, hatcheries, you have hatchling release programs where both children and adults you can hold a hatchling in your hand, and all of those that experience of being like uh, is really transformative. So I guess is seeing a tiger in a forest or a lion in the savannah, but or a whale or a dolphin. Each of those has a particular kind of value, but I think the sheer proximity of sitting next to this wild animal that spends years out at sea and comes ashore for this really for an hour or 2 hours, depending on which species you are, and you can sit right next to it while it's digging its nest and laying its eggs, and all of this is in some way, I think it makes them a accessible, and b really it sort of builds this sort of emotional connection,
mm.
uh, because has been really valuable and sort of makes people go overboard as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I think that's when people say sea turtles are uh, oceans ambassadors for conservations, or there's flagships. I think
right.
that is really an extraordinary role that they've played over the last 70, 80 years that people have been engaged in sea turtle conservation.
Mm. Yes, I was reading your article on the flagship or gunboat sort of divide, which was interesting, and I wonder if you could speak to how do we engage with sea turtles, um, whilst bringing in their greater importance to ecosystems as a whole. They're sort of seen as this iconic singularity, but how do we educate people on their broader importance in a whole ecosystem?
Right. Um, uh, to sort of clarify what we meant there, when conservationists become obsessed with any species, and it could be a
Mm,
tiger or turtle, um, you you place the value of conserving a population, above everything else, right? And in setting up parks that you exclude people from, or setting up marine parks or marine no fishing zones where fishermen are excluded from fishing, you create this constituency that has now been negatively affected by this conservation icon. And I think in all of those instances, um, they start to have the opposite effect of what you want, which is you want these flagships to be building consensus and building support for conservation at a broader level. Because at the end
mm,
of the day, if you go back to sort of philosophical question about conservation, who is it for? And uh, there's a biocentric view that it's for the organism. Sea turtles have an inherent right to exist. Turtles have an inherent right to. Tigers have a right to exist. Ecosystems have a right to exist. Now, I won't get into the philosophical problems of that approach. Uh, it's not very practical, right?
mm,
It sort of sets one group of people against another. And what really, and again, one could say this is just, this is another philosophy. I believe, and I think an increasing number of conservationists are beginning to recognize that we need far broader social and political support for conservation.
mm,
And we're not going to achieve that by sort of creating these, by polarizing groups and setting people up in opposition to each other. And so I asked and so that's why they, gunboats or battleships, as other, conservation biologists have called them, because they're creating conflict rather than, building support. And I think the way to build support is to privilege human well-being and ecosystem health equally.
mm,
Uh, and it's possible to do that. It's possible to ask hard questions about what development really is. When we say privilege human well-being, we're not talking about uh, you know sort of the hyper-developed, typically Western capitalist model of development, right?
mm,
It's not to say that people shouldn't have cars or roads or hospitals, but there's also a particular model of development that we can question. But you know, one can still, if one is thoughtful about it, one can think about ways in which both ecosystem health and human well-being can both be accomplished.
mm,
Um, Sometimes hard to accomplish it, both of those if you get focused on one species. Sometimes I think, and which is why I keep going back to say that we need to zoom out from the turtle picture a little bit, because sometimes if I want to do the right thing for turtles, it's not only is it may not be the right, may not have, um, not only may it have negative consequences for people, it may also have negative consequences for ecosystems, as we're discovering with green turtles that are, as of October last year, they're listed in the IUCN Red List as least concern. And the areas that they've excluded, they've kind of like destroyed the seagrass meadows that were
mm,
there, creating quite the conundrum, right? Because
mm,
people are, you could be on the one hand very happy the green turtles came back, but on the other hand, that's not necessarily good for everything else. Um, and so, in that sense, I do think a species focus can really kind of be potentially detrimental to both humans and human well-being and ecosystems. Uh,
mm,
but if we zoomed out and said we want to balance out, yeah, human and ecosystem benefits, uh, I mean, every action has some winners and losers, but we can sort of minimize the extent of loss and maximize the win,
mm.
if attempts to optimize that more broadly.
Yes. No, that makes sense to sort of move away from a turtle-centric view of saving turtles in a way. Um, I think part of your work has been to trace the history of the conservation movement of turtles. In your book, From Soup to Superstar, it's, a narrative, a story of particular characters who've been key in the development of these conservation efforts. And I wonder, why do you think it's important to have a sort of meta history of your own conservation movement as someone who is currently trying to um, conserve sea turtles, amongst other things?
Well, I should preface my comments by saying that it's sort of ironic because um, I was I was terrible at history in school, and my history teacher really did not like me very much. So, so to be extolling the virtues of historical approaches, you she'd be amused by that. Um, yeah, but I think it's important for two reasons.
Mm,
Uh, I think one, and for me, the more intuitive reason, the more emotive reason for me personally as well, is I think that these stories are just wonderful.
mm,
They're they're evocative, they're inspiring, and they're moving, and sometimes they're just sort of like you know like they evoke awe in some sense when I talk about, say, Satish Bhaskar spending 5 months on an island on a marooned by himself, that where he had no access to, I mean, to civilization, until the boat, until the fishing boat that came to pick him up. And I tell students, and I'm like, you guys get, when your Uber is 3 minutes late, you're standing around going, "Where's my Uber? Where's my Uber?" The boat that was supposed to pick him up came a month late, like one whole month, and he's sitting there by himself on this island. It's like, so there's these fabulous stories that are, not even inspiring in the way that I want to do that, but
mm,
I'm like, oh my God, that was such a cool thing to have done. So I think just the narrative value of those stories is in a sense enough for me. Uh, as a conservationist, though, I think it's important to know how we got here.
mm,
And sometimes why we do the things we do are historical contingency, they're historical accident, they're they were historically determined, but for the wrong reasons, because there was some of it was because of colonization. We have parks,
mm,
we have particular models of conservation because we inherited them, from the West. The idea of pristine wildernesses, for example, which um, people pursue with such religious zeal that my colleague and I have termed it Christianity. So, why do these parks exist? Because, Christianity came from, the Thoreauvian idea of a wilderness.
mm,
So it's important to recognize why we do the things we do, and also that some of it was inherited because of power. I mean, India's, was, um, uh, I mean, much poorer country for, because of several hundred years of colonization, and it sort of improved over the last few decades since independence. But nevertheless, why do we have similar models to the ones that they have in the West? And it's partly because we inherited them, but it's also because Indian urban elite bought into those models.
mm,
Indian urban elite were the white people of Indian conservation, right? And so to sort of trace those histories and say, actually, these are things that, you know, we need to rethink.
mm,
Why are we doing things the way we're doing them? Or to look back and say, we protected olive ridleys and green turtles in India because in the 70s and 80s, there was massive direct take and there were genuine concerns that the population would crash, right? And so went out and did these surveys. This is the information that we gathered. Sure, I can put a data table together and draw a graph, right? That's just numbers. But
mm,
also to trace why at that particular time, a particular group of people looked at those numbers and said, oh my God, we need to set up Project Turtle and take these actions. And why now, 25 years or 30 years later, perhaps those actions are not the most appropriate, right? So, in a sense, understanding history allows us, I think, to better, um, uh, you know, understand what we're doing and rethink it as and when needed, which, as a community, I don't think we do enough of.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I would have to agree with that. Um, I think one final question I'd like to ask is perhaps aside from using history in some of the work you do, I'm thinking of the magazine Current Conservation. You use art or you get artists involved and broader themes in the humanities. And I wonder, um, in your experience, what is the importance of bringing together scientists like you with, I suppose, more creative ways of education?
I think it's, um, I'm going to go like far out
Mm,
on that limb and say that actually science produces knowledge. And of course, we talk about science communication and all of that, and people,
mm,
there's nice magazines and so on. But I think humans, I mean, I think we all have, every human has the capacity for critical and rational thinking. But there's, as the neuroscientists have long pointed out, right? We all have left brain, right brain,
mm,
capacities to different degrees. And I think we don't tap into the, in a sense, becoming a conservationist is not about, you know, uh, you know, n- saving electricity or not eating meat or, donating a few $100s to your favorite conservation nonprofit. It's really about internalizing what kind of a world we want to live in, right? And that isn't going to happen with data and numbers. That's really sort of thinking about where my place in society, which is also, I think, important. I mean, like, I think I don't distinguish society and the environment in some sense. It's like, what are our values in this world? And those
mm,
values, as a scientist, I believe very strongly in science as a method of extracting, of generating knowledge. But we then process that emotionally. And so I go well beyond art. I mean, I think we should communicate our messages through art. Obviously, like the popular writing and the creative writing,
mm,
but also through music. The theater, folk arts. The NGO that I now have been that we started about 20 years ago. We have a program on sports. So we have a program with youth in Christian communities that's sports and development, and environment is sort of this little peripheral thing that we're trying to engage in through the things that we do with them. So it could be any of these activities, and I've just recently been talking about introducing theater into some of our work. So I
mm,
think all of those ways in which uh, humans actually uh, discover themselves, and it's through all of these creative modes, right? I think it's really important to engage with and use all those avenues to connect with people.
mm. That's amazing. Well, thank you very much for your time talking to us. I've really enjoyed learning more about sea turtles and much more than sea turtles. Um,
Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Karthik. Thank you.
Thank you.